They don't raise their voice. They don't slam doors. They don't throw words like weapons or make scenes that everyone remembers. But somehow, when they're done with you, you feel it in a way that never leaves. The empath who goes silent doesn't need to scream to destroy you. Their silence does something far worse. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about power. The world has taught us that strength is loud, that the person who yells the loudest wins. That dominance comes from aggression, from taking up space, from forcing others to hear you. We've been trained to associate quiet with weakness, soft with powerless, sensitive with fragile. And if you've ever been called too sensitive, too quiet, too soft, this is for you. Because what the world doesn't understand is that you're not weak. You never were. You're operating in a dimension most people don't even know exists. The empath doesn't fight the way others do. They don't argue. They don't defend. They don't beg to be understood. When they're pushed too far, something else happens. Something the loudest person in the room will never see coming. They go silent. Not the silence of retreat. Not the silence of fear. But the kind of silence that severs. The kind that walks away without explanation. The kind that leaves you standing there, suddenly aware of how empty the space feels without them. It's not dramatic. It's not theatrical. It's surgical. One day they're there, absorbing your chaos, holding space for your emotions, carrying the weight of your unspoken pain. And the next day, they're not. Not because they hate you. Not because they're trying to punish you. But because they finally realized something you didn't. That their presence was keeping you comfortable in your dysfunction. That their silence was protecting you from yourself. People think empaths are easy to break because they feel everything. They see someone who cries at movies, who takes criticism to heart, who apologizes even when they're not wrong, and they assume that person can be controlled, manipulated, drained. And for a while, they're right. The empath gives and gives. They explain and re-explain. They stay when they should leave. They forgive what shouldn't be forgiven. They make excuses for behavior that doesn't deserve excuses. But there's a limit, a breaking point. And when that line is crossed, the empath doesn't explode. They vanish. And that's when the real destruction begins. Because the person who spent so long draining them suddenly realizes what they lost. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in the quiet moments. When they need someone to understand them and no one does. When they try to manipulate someone else and it doesn't work the same way. When they look for that softness, that patience, that unconditional presence, and it's gone. Forever. The empath who goes silent isn't trying to hurt you. They're simply no longer available to save you from the consequences of your own choices. And for someone who built their world on the assumption that the empath would always be there, always forgive, always return, that absence feels like annihilation. That silence becomes the loudest thing they've ever heard. You were never weak. You were just kind to people who mistook kindness for permission. And now, without a single word, without a single confrontation, you've shown them the difference. The silence that shatters isn't about revenge. It's about freedom. Yours. It started long before you had words for it. Long before you understood that not everyone walked into a room and immediately felt the weight of everything unsaid. You were young when you first noticed that something was different. That when your parents fought, even behind closed doors, even in whispers, you felt it in your chest like it was your own anger. Like it was your fault. Like you were supposed to fix it. You didn't know then that you were absorbing things that weren't meant for you. That your nervous system was picking up frequencies other people couldn't hear. All you knew was that the world felt heavier for you than it seemed to feel for everyone else. And you had no idea why. When someone walked into the room upset, you felt it before they said a word. When there was tension at the dinner table, it sat in your stomach like stones. When your friend was hurt, even if they smiled and said they were fine, you knew they weren't. You felt the truth underneath the performance. And it confused you, because no one else seemed to notice. No one else seemed to carry the emotional residue of every interaction, every conflict, every unspoken disappointment. So you learned to adapt. You became the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over, the one who apologized first, even when you weren't wrong, just to make the tension stop. Because the tension hurt you more than it hurt anyone else. Their anger didn't just bounce off you. It lived inside you. Their sadness became your sadness. Their anxiety became your responsibility. And the worst part? You thought this was normal. You thought everyone felt this way. That everyone spent hours replaying conversations, wondering if they said the wrong thing, if they hurt someone without meaning to, if they could have done more. You didn't realize that most people moved on, that most people didn't lose sleep over whether someone else was okay, that most people had boundaries you didn't even know existed. You gave endless chances. To the friend who only called when they needed something, to the family member who criticized everything you did, to the partner who made you feel like you were too much and not enough at the same time. You stayed when every part of you wanted to leave. You forgave betrayals that should have been final. You swallowed your truth over and over because speaking it might cause conflict, and conflict felt like death. You accommodated. You adjusted. You shrank yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. You dimmed your light so others wouldn't feel threatened. You stayed quiet when you should have spoken. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You said yes when everything in you was screaming no. And you told yourself this was kindness. This was love. This was what good people do. But underneath all of that, something else was happening. Something you couldn't see yet. Every time you silenced yourself to keep the peace, a part of you disappeared. Every time you absorbed someone else's pain and pretended you were fine, the weight got heavier. Every time you gave more than you had, hoping it would finally be enough, you lost a little more of yourself. You became an expert at reading people, at knowing what they needed before they asked, at adjusting your energy to match theirs, to make them comfortable, to avoid their rejection. You learned to be whatever they needed you to be. The listener, the supporter, the one who always understood, the one who never judged, the one who was always, always there. And they loved you for it. They needed you for it. But they didn't see you. Not really. Because you had become so good at disappearing into their needs that your own became invisible, even to you. You thought your silence was survival, that staying quiet, staying small, staying soft was the only way to be loved, the only way to be safe. You thought if you could just absorb enough, forgive enough, give enough, things would get better. People would finally see your worth. They would stop hurting you. They would appreciate what you carried for them. But they didn't. Because people who are used to taking rarely notice when someone is empty. They just keep taking until there's nothing left. And the truth you couldn't see then, the truth that was buried under years of conditioning and people-pleasing and emotional self-sacrifice, was this: your silence wasn't protecting you. It was erasing you. Slowly, quietly, completely. You were disappearing into everyone else's needs, and no one even noticed you were gone. It doesn't happen the way people expect. There's no explosion, no final argument, no dramatic exit. One day, something inside you simply stops. Not breaks, stops. Like a machine that's been running for years suddenly powering down. And in that moment of stillness, everything changes. You don't even know what triggered it. Maybe it was the 100th time someone dismissed your feelings. Maybe it was the moment you realized you'd been apologizing for things that weren't your fault. Maybe it was just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that sleep can't fix. The kind that comes from years of carrying weight that was never yours to carry. Whatever it was, something shifted. And you felt it in your bones. You stop explaining yourself. Not because you're angry. Not because you're trying to prove a point. But because you finally understand that the people who were supposed to get it never will. And the ones who do get it never needed the explanation in the first place. You've spent years trying to make people understand your heart, your intentions, your truth. You've repeated yourself until the words lost meaning. You've defended your character to people who had already decided who you were. And in this moment, you realize it was never about understanding. It was about control. So you stop. You stop defending. You stop justifying. You stop trying to convince anyone of your worth. Because something deeper has awakened. The realization that your worth was never up for debate. That the people who made you feel like you had to prove yourself were the ones who needed you small, manageable, grateful for the crumbs of validation they occasionally threw your way. Before, your silence was fear. It was the silence of someone afraid to rock the boat. Afraid to be too much. Afraid to lose people who were already halfway gone. You stayed quiet because you thought if you just kept the peace, if you just didn't make waves, people would stay. They would finally see you. They would choose you. But now your silence is something else entirely. It's not retreat. It's detachment. And there's a difference most people will never understand. Retreat is temporary. It's the silence of someone who's hurt, who's pulling back to regroup, who still cares deeply about the outcome. Detachment is permanent. It's the silence of someone who has stopped investing emotional energy in people who were never going to return it. It's not punishment. It's preservation. You don't announce it. You don't make declarations. You don't tell people they've lost you. You just stop showing up the way you used to. You stop pouring into cups that have always had holes in the bottom. You stop lighting yourself on fire to keep others warm. And the strangest thing happens. No one notices at first, because they were so used to you giving that they never considered you might stop. The shift is internal, but the effects are seismic. Where you once felt the need to respond to every message, every demand, every guilt trip, now you don't. Not out of spite, not out of bitterness, but out of a clarity so sharp it cuts through years of conditioning. These people don't deserve your energy. They never did. And you're done pretending otherwise. You look back at all the times you stayed silent to avoid conflict, and you see it differently now. That wasn't strength. That wasn't love. That was self-abandonment. You sacrificed your peace to maintain relationships with people who never once considered sacrificing theirs for you. You swallowed your truth to make room for their comfort. You bled yourself dry trying to fill people who had no intention of ever being full. And now, you're done. Not in a loud, theatrical way, but in the quietest, most absolute way possible. You're no longer available for the same conversations, the same patterns, the same one-sided dynamics. When someone reaches for you expecting the same response they've always gotten, they find nothing, because you're no longer there. Not physically absent, but energetically gone. This is the moment the manipulator panics. The narcissist loses their anchor. The taker realizes the well has run dry, because you were their constant, their emotional supply, the one who always came back, the one who always forgave, the one who always made excuses for their behavior. And now, without warning, without negotiation, without a chance to love bomb their way back in, you're unavailable. They'll call it cold. They'll say you've changed. They'll tell you you're not the person they knew. And they're right. You're not. Because the person they knew was slowly disappearing under the weight of their expectations, their demands, their emotional vampirism. The person you are now has remembered something they forgot a long time ago. That you were never meant to be a doormat. That your empathy was never meant to be a weapon used against you. That your silence, when used correctly, is the most powerful boundary you'll ever set. You're not the same person, and you never will be again. The breaking point wasn't loud, but it was final. And in that silence, you found something you'd been searching for your entire life. Yourself. There's a reason people fear the empath's silence more than anyone else's anger. It's because anger can be deflected. It can be turned around, weaponized, used as evidence of instability. But silence is undefeatable. It offers nothing to argue with, nothing to twist, nothing to use against you. And for the people who built their power on your reactions, your silence is the one thing they can't survive. The empath's silence is not passive. It's surgical. It cuts through illusion with precision most people will never possess. Because while others are listening to words, the empath is reading energy. They feel the intention beneath the apology, the manipulation beneath the compliment, the emptiness beneath the charm. They don't need proof. They don't need evidence. They know. And when they go silent, it's not because they don't have anything to say. It's because they've said everything that mattered, and it was ignored. Now, they're done translating their truth into a language you refuse to understand. Here's what happens when an empath stops engaging. The narcissist loses their supply. The manipulator loses their grip. The gaslighter loses their chaos. Because all of those dynamics require participation. They require someone who cares enough to react, to defend, to explain, to stay in the game. The empath's silence removes the board entirely. And suddenly, the person who is so confident in their control realizes they're standing in an empty room, performing for an audience that's no longer watching. This is where the psychology gets interesting. When an empath goes silent, they're not running away. They're strategically withdrawing access. They've stopped feeding the system that was feeding off them. And the people who were dependent on that system, on the empath's emotional availability, their endless patience, their willingness to absorb abuse and still show up, those people spiral. Not because the empath is doing anything to them, but because they're forced, for the first time, to sit with themselves. And for someone who's been using others as a distraction from their own emptiness, that's unbearable. The empath sees through facades instantly, not because they're smarter, not because they're analyzing, but because they feel the dissonance. When someone's words don't match their energy, the empath feels it like a frequency that's off-key. When someone is lying, even to themselves, the empath feels the crack in the foundation. They don't need to investigate. They don't need to gather evidence. The truth announces itself in the space between what's said and what's meant. And for years, they stayed silent about what they saw. They gave people the benefit of the doubt. They made excuses. They convinced themselves they were wrong, that they were reading too much into things, that maybe this time would be different. But the thing about empaths is this: they remember everything. Every inconsistency, every broken promise, every time the mask slipped. They don't forget. They just stop mentioning it. Until the day they stop mentioning anything at all. When that silence arrives, it does something most people don't expect. It creates a mirror, and the person who's been running from themselves suddenly has nowhere to hide. The empath is no longer absorbing their projections, no longer validating their delusions, no longer playing the role they were assigned. And in that absence, the manipulator is left with the one thing they've been avoiding their entire life: the truth of who they are, without someone to blame, without someone to control, without someone to make them feel powerful. This is why the silence destroys them. Not because it's cruel, but because it's honest. The empath doesn't need to say a word. Their absence speaks volumes. It says, "I see who you are. I see what you've done, and I'm no longer participating." That truth, delivered without anger, without drama, without negotiation, is more devastating than any argument could ever be. Behaviorally, silence does something words never can. It forces the other person to fill the void. And when they do, they reveal themselves. The narcissist will rage, trying to provoke a reaction that restores their sense of control. The manipulator will cycle through tactics: guilt, love bombing, victimhood, desperate to pull the empath back into the dance. The gaslighter will try to rewrite history, to convince the empath they're overreacting, that nothing was ever that bad. But none of it works, because the empath isn't listening anymore. They're not even in the room. And here's the part that validates everything you've ever felt. You were never weak for staying silent before. You were gathering data, learning patterns, understanding exactly who you were dealing with. And now that you've gone silent by choice, by strategy, by self-preservation, you're not avoiding confrontation. You're refusing to engage in battles that were rigged from the start. You're not giving them closure because closure was never theirs to demand. You're not explaining yourself because people who were committed to misunderstanding you don't deserve your clarification. The empath's silence is the most powerful weapon they'll never learn to name. Because it's not a weapon at all. It's a boundary, a reclamation, a statement that says, "You no longer have access to me." And for people who built their entire identity on having access, on taking without asking, on draining without consequence, that silence is the end of their world. Not because you destroyed them, but because you stopped letting them destroy you. The empath you see now is not the same person who used to break themselves to fix others. They've evolved into something most people don't recognize: sovereign. Not cold, not closed off, but selective in a way that makes people uncomfortable. Because they've learned what most people spend their entire lives avoiding: not everyone deserves access. They feel deeply still. That hasn't changed. But now they feel without losing themselves in the process. They've mastered the art of emotional detachment, not as disconnection, but as discernment. They can sit with someone's pain without absorbing it. They can witness someone's chaos without entering it. They can love people from a distance that protects their peace. Before, they stayed to fix people. They believed if they just gave enough, loved enough, explained enough, people would change. Now, they leave without a word. Because they understand that people don't change because you want them to. They change when the cost of staying the same becomes unbearable. And the empath is no longer willing to be the cushion that makes dysfunction comfortable. Before, they needed to be heard. They needed people to understand their heart, their intentions, their truth. They would explain themselves until they were exhausted, hoping that this time, finally, someone would get it. Now, they know their value doesn't require anyone's validation. The right people will see it without explanation. The wrong people wouldn't see it if you drew them a map. There's a calmness to them now that wasn't there before. A groundedness. They move through the world unbothered by opinions that used to devastate them. They don't react to provocations designed to pull them back into old patterns. They don't chase closure from people who were never honest enough to give it. They don't argue with those who are committed to misunderstanding them. They simply exist in their truth, and that truth is so solid that nothing can shake it. But beneath that calm is something else. A strength that makes people nervous. Not aggressive, Not loud, but unmovable. They've become the person others can't manipulate, can't guilt, can't break. Because they've already survived the worst thing that could happen to an empath, the death of who they used to be. And what emerged from that death is someone who knows their worth, guards their energy, and refuses to shrink for anyone's comfort. They don't explain their boundaries. They enforce them. They don't announce their exits. They just leave. They don't perform their healing. They live it. And the people who once had unlimited access to their heart now find a door that's permanently closed. Not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. This is the empath's final form. Not hardened, not bitter, but untouchable. And the people who mistake their peace for weakness will learn, the hard way, that sovereignty looks soft until you try to violate it. Here's the truth no one tells you about empaths who go silent. They're not cruel. They're protecting their peace. They didn't become cold. They became selective. They didn't lose their kindness. They stopped giving it to people who weaponized it against them. The world will call you distant, guarded, too much or not enough. They'll say you've changed, that you're not the person you used to be. And they're right. You're not. Because the person you used to be was dying under the weight of everyone else's expectations. The person you are now has learned something most people never will. Your silence is your sanctuary, and not everyone deserves to hear your voice. You didn't stop caring. You started caring about the right things. About yourself. About your peace. About the people who actually see you, not the version of you they needed you to be. You learned that protecting your energy isn't selfish, it's survival. That saying no without explanation isn't rude, it's respect for yourself. That walking away without closure isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The people who love the old you will mourn this version. Because the old you was easier to control. The old you said yes when you meant no. The old you stayed when you should have left. The old you made their comfort more important than your peace. But this version can't be manipulated, can't be guilt, can't be convinced to betray themselves for anyone. If this resonated with you, know that you're not alone. There are others like you who've walked this path, who've learned this language, who understand what it costs to choose yourself. Drop a comment, subscribe, and remember, your silence isn't weakness. It's the most powerful language you'll ever speak. The quietest people have the loudest minds and the sharpest boundaries.